As usual with our weekly talk from the book Mukhtasar Minhaaj al-Qaasideen, the abridgment of the methodology of those who are desirous, meaning desirous of spiritual perfection. So we have been, for a while now, in the book on enjoining good and forbidding evil. We are up to the point now where it's discussing the enjoining good and forbidding evil with the rulers. And we had actually spoken about this matter, not so much enjoining good and forbidding evil, but specifically about our relationship with those who are in power, the rulers, those who are the rich, those who are politicians, and things of that nature. We had spoken about that at length and how the scholars spoke about the relationship we should have with them. And so there's some interesting details that we're going to talk about as we go into this, etc. This particular section in the book is a lot of anecdote and a lot of stories or examples from the Salaf as-Salih, the righteous predecessors. So we'll be doing that. We'll be doing that mostly, and so we'll be going mostly from the translation in this instance because it's long stretches of information that are better done in a flowing style rather than me trying to translate on the fly. So when it comes to, and just for anybody who's interested, this is streamed live. I am doing this now, but now it's on YouTube instead of on Facebook. Had a change in technology, and so now I have to stream it on YouTube first and then upload it to Facebook, just so everybody's aware. And it's Saeed Purcell is the name you're looking for if you're trying to find it on YouTube. So there's many different levels for commanding good and forbidding evil. We spoke about this. This is the hadith that we're all very familiar with, which speaks about when you see an evil that you should stop it with your hand, and if you're unable to do that, then you should stop it with your tongue. And if you're unable to do even that, then you should at the very least, hate it in your heart. And that is the weakest of faith. So that is what he's alluding to when he talks about the different levels or the different qualities of drowning in chords here. There, I think we're saved. So that's what he's alluding to. And what he's alluding to here is that when you're talking about enjoining good and forbidding evil with the rulers, is that you're limited in what you can do because of the nature of the ruler. The ruler is somebody who has power, who has the ability to implement things and bring to bear institutions and instruments that the common person cannot. For instance, we're referring to things like, say, the police or the courts or the army or things like that, etc. They have real power, not the perception of power that most of us have, which is contentional or conditional, I should say, where it's limited according to the permission that we get from the person who actually has power. So that's what he's alluding to. And so what he's talking about here is that when you're approaching a ruler and you're looking to enjoin good or forbid evil, now, enjoining good obviously usually isn't that difficult because usually you're encouraging to do something good and hopefully they're already recognized that it's good. More often than not, he's alluding to the prevention of evil when he's talking about this, but enjoining good or forbidding evil, you can run into situations from both sides. So he says, when you approach them, it's only the first two levels. In other words, hating it in your heart and speaking out against it, that's available to us. We don't have power sufficient to try and impose ourselves upon the rulers or the leaders. So that's what he's alluding to. So he says that when you would approach them, you're going to clarify for them, you're going to help them understand the evil of what it is that they're doing, and you're going to try and appeal to their hearts. So you're going to try and educate them about the evil in case they're ignorant of the evil. Remember, we talked about this in the stages that we go through when we're forbidding evil, that you try to have husna dhan, you try to have a good opinion of your brothers or sisters, and that you assume that perhaps they're simply ignorant of whatever this evil may be that they're caught up into. And so you approach it from that standpoint of you're just trying to do them the favor of opening their eyes to something they might have been misinformed about or lacked information about. And so you start from that place. You start from trying to inform them. And so you try to educate them about the evil. In addition to that, especially if you don't find education is having the effect that we would like, we can think of certain presidents that have tried to be educated about certain matters that are widely accepted by scientists all over the world, and they continue to reject it. We won't mention any names, but I think we know who we're talking about. But so when education fails, then you have to go to the next level, which is giving a ma'widha, or something that's appealing to the heart. In other words, now you tried to reach their mind. That didn't work. So now you have to go a little deeper. You have to try and reach into their heart. You have to try and tap into something emotional, something that moves them to get them to act. And so this requires a different level and a different approach. But again, it's all speech, because this is the highest level that we can go to when it comes to dealing with these people. And so you looked at these things. And he says, now when it comes to becoming harsh, we can't go to the final step, which is using our hands. So when it comes to using harsh words with the rulers, he mentions here, and it's an interesting point that he makes. He says, as for saying things to the rulers such as, are you a tyrant? So you're starting to kind of get in their face now. Are you a tyrant? Do you not fear Allah? Speaking to them in this way. And so he says that the scholars, when they write about this in general, they say, if you have any reason to fear that harm might occur to others, pay attention real closely, that harm might occur to others, not yourself, but to others, by you speaking out like this, then you should refrain. But he continues, these same scholars say that if the only harm that you're afraid of, legitimate, and this doesn't mean that you've been threatened directly. This is something that we were talking about in the last Imams conference, is even the reasonable expectation of harm or need is sufficient enough. So if you have good enough reason to believe that you could come to harm, that if it's only you that could be harmed, these scholars would say, then you should speak out in this harsh fashion. In other words, you should get in their face if it could cause your harm. This is what the scholars he's quoting are saying. But then he follows up, the author, Ahmed ibn Qudama, rahimahullah, and he says, in his opinion, he feels that even in that instance, you shouldn't. And this was his explanation, and it's a good explanation, mashallah. He said that the goal in preventing evil is so that the ruler here doesn't fall into a greater evil than they're already involved in. So they're already doing some evil that you're trying to stop. And if you speak out harshly to them, and they may inflict harm on you, might not harm anybody else, but they may inflict harm on you, then he says you shouldn't do it. In the opposite of what these other scholars were saying, that he was quoting. You shouldn't do it. And this is his reason. He says, because you don't want to cause him to fall into another harm, another evil. Because harming you for speaking out would be an additional evil in addition to the one he's already doing. And that's counter to what our objective is. We spoke about this when we've spoken about the goal of nasiha. Nasiha the goal is to rectify a situation, to change a condition that somebody's in. And so we need to be mindful of the outcome that we're looking for. So if the outcome we're looking for is to make a change, but we have a reasonable expectation that if we try and tell this person such and such that it won't change, then we're not achieving our goal. So we should look for someone else to do that, or we should find another way to do that. And so in this instance, we want to command good and we want to forbid evil of these rulers. Educating them didn't work. Trying to appeal to their emotions didn't work. So now we're thinking we should talk to them harshly. If you have a reasonable expectation that they could harm you, according to Ibn Qudama, then you shouldn't do it. Because you're not achieving your objective now. He's most likely going to ignore you and harm you, which will add evil on top of the evil. So not only did you not achieve your objective, you actually made the situation worse. So this is his argument that he makes. And I think it's actually a pretty strong argument to say that you have to look at the objectives here. What is the goal of what you're trying to do? We have to be mindful. We don't always want to speak out just for the sake of speaking out. That isn't what we do. We do not speak out just for the sake of speaking out. Because sometimes speaking out at the wrong time, I'm sure some of us have had this experience, saying the right thing at the wrong time can be a huge catastrophe. You may be right, you may have been morally right, but your timing or the choice of who or how you spoke those words led to a greater harm. And we gave examples in previous lectures about Ibn Taymiyyah and the Tartars and things like this, etc., about picking and choosing when you command good and forbid evil, trying to avoid a greater harm by ignoring a lesser harm. So this is one of the fine points. So now we get into some of the stories that they were talking about. We're going to try and not delve too long because there's a lot of stories here, so we're just going to cover them in brief. So one here you have Imam Ahmed, rahimahullah. He mentions a story here from him, or a statement from him here, is that you should never disparage a ruler. So he's saying never speak harshly against a ruler. And if you know the history of Imam Ahmed, you should know Imam Ahmed never did. He never spoke harshly against the rulers in his time, even though the rulers in his time were involved in a great innovation in terms of not worship, not in matters of like hair-splitting of fiqh issues, but in major matters of aqeedah. They were asserting certain things about the Quran that were completely untrue, that were completely false, and they were forcing the entire ummah to accept it. So much so that they even tortured the scholars, and they killed many of them. As a matter of fact, when Imam Ahmed was brought to the rulers the first time, along the way it was him and one other scholar that was being dragged through the desert to be brought to the king. The conditions were so awful, the other scholar that was with him, his name escapes me at the moment right now, he died along the way. They had to bury him in the desert, and Imam Ahmed prayed janazah over him. And then they sent them back because the king had died in the interim, and so they wound up going back. They never actually got to the citadel. But he was brought back to the citadel again, and he was tortured repeatedly. The way the story goes, he was beaten so severely on a daily basis, they would beat him until he passed out. What were they trying to do? They were trying to get him to agree to what they were proposing about the Quran, about the proper, in their mind, the proper understanding of the Quran. And he refused, to the point of being beaten into unconsciousness repeatedly. But he never said a bad word about them. He never said a bad word about them. Even when he was approached later in life, asked whether or not they should take up arms against them, he told the people no. He told the people no. He was reluctant to do that because of the great evil that could ensue. He understood that the good and the evil here, the evil of taking up arms had a much greater chance of bringing on greater harm or more harm. And this is what we see historically many times, is that when people revolt, their initial intentions might be good, but the outcome oftentimes winds up being worse, or at the very least, much of the same. Rarely is it better. So he was very reluctant to disparage the rulers. And here he's saying, do not disparage the rulers. He said, for his sword is unsheathed. In other words, he has his sword drawn. So you speak badly to him, he might just feel, sufficiently irritated with you, and he'll off with his head. Or as Imam Ahmed's life shows us, you may be tortured for a great deal of time. Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, so many scholars throughout the history of the Ummah have suffered at the hands of the rulers. And he makes an interesting point about this idea about the rulers later on here. So that's one example he says. And he says, and actually he makes this point, the very next point he makes. He said, we should not think of the examples of the early scholars and their courage to reprimand the rulers. So what he's alluding to here is many times you'll find examples from early scholars where they were very brave and courageous, and they would stand in front of the rulers and speak truth to power in very, very stern ways. And they spoke very harshly with the rulers. And so he's saying we shouldn't look at that. Now, that might seem a little strange at first. We shouldn't look at that. And this is why he says it. He says we shouldn't look at these examples because in the early times, the rulers used to honor the scholars. They used to respect knowledge. And so this is not the case. Now remember, again, we've talked about this before. This is Ahmed ibn Qudama right now. He says, but this is not the case anymore. Now this is Ahmed ibn Qudama, one of the greatest scholars in the history of the Ummah, writing 700 years ago in Islamic lands. And he's saying, this is not the case anymore. So, not to be so bold as some of them used to be in the past, 700 years ago in Muslim lands when the Muslims were strong. We're 700 years later. The Muslims are, to put it politely, fractured. And we know what our situation is. We know the situation that just happened within the last week, the Muslims' condition. So speaking truth to power, especially to some of the rulers in Muslim lands, is a very dangerous. You have a high likelihood that something negative is going to happen to you if you speak out. And so he's saying, don't take the example of the early scholars and what they did. It was praiseworthy, absolutely, but they understood their circumstance. Yes, they spoke out, but they spoke out because they realized these scholars, or these rulers, respected the scholars. And you'll find examples of that in the stories that he brings next, because I think we mentioned this before, is that the scholars in those days, they wouldn't go to the rulers. They would wait for the rulers to come to them. They made themselves the one to be respected, and the rulers did. But that's obviously not the case most of these times anymore. It's the other way around. So now he goes into some of the stories. He mentions here one about Omar ibn al-Khattab, where Sa'id ibn Amir went to Omar ibn al-Khattab and he said to him that I advise you with certain recommendable acts of Islam. He said, fear Allah for your subjects and not the vice versa. In other words, don't fear your subjects for Allah. Fear Allah for your subjects. In regards, when he says for your subjects, in regards to your subjects. In other words, fear Allah regarding your people, regarding your ummah, the people that you're charged with responsibility for. Don't fear the people in regards to Allah. In other words, don't make your primary concern the people. Make your primary concern Allah in regards of your people, not the other way around. And vice versa, he said, your words should conform to your deeds. So what you say, you should do. He said, because deeds, they speak for themselves. So even if you don't say it and you do it, your deeds will speak for themselves. Your quality will be known. Love for all Muslims what you love for yourself. This obviously is the same as the hadith that we hear so often. And rush into perils to reach the truth so long as you recognize it. In other words, work hard for the truth. Whenever you see the truth, head for the truth. And then fear none but Allah alone. And so when Omar heard this, he said, who can uphold all of this? Who can do this? He said, a man that's been entrusted with your trust. In other words, being a ruler who's given that power. Because it takes power to be able to accomplish some of these things, to be able to concern yourself for the people. Now, another one here, Qatada is talking about Omar again. Omar had gone out of the mosque with a companion of his by the name of Al-Ghurud, rahimahullah, and they came across a woman in the street, and as they were greeting her, she responded and said, speaking to Omar, radiallahu anhu, she says, I've known you since you were quite young, and you used to be called Omer, little Omar, basically. And when you became a strong man, they called you Omar. Days have passed, and you are now Amirul Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers. Fear Allah for your subjects. Be mindful of the fact that fear from death instigates fear from loss. So she was advising him to fear Allah. Advising him to fear Allah, and that you should not fear death. In other words, don't let death be that which drives you, because it makes you fear loss. And so the person that's with him, he said, Al-Ghurud, he told her, he said, you've spoken very boldly to the caliph, and caused him to cry, because Omar started to cry after she said this. He said, the man saying, look at what you've done. You've spoken so harshly to him, and you've made him cry. And then Omar remarked, told him, Bess, leave it alone, let it be. He said, do you not know who this woman is? And he didn't know who it was, and so he told her, he said, this is Khawala ibn Hakim. This is the woman who you find complaining to Allah at the beginning of Surah Al-Mujadilah. This is the woman who complains to Allah about her situation, meaning again about her spouse. And Allah answers her. So her plea to Allah is recorded in the Quran. So Omar is saying, he says, do you not know who this woman is? So look at the respect he had for her. She was mentioned indirectly even in the Quran. And then Allah heard her. He's like, do you not know who this woman is? So he didn't mind that she spoke to him that way, even though he commanded thousands of forces and ruled, from one land to another, from out past Sham into Iraq, towards Afghanistan, and then further over all the way to the Maghreb and everywhere else. He said, do you not know who she is? And then so now another story he gives here. A man from the tribe of Azd approached Muawiyah, and he told him, this is speaking to Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, who was the Khalifa, it might not be the best word, but he was the ruler of the Muslims after the death of Al-Hasan ibn Ali. He said, fear Allah and know that every day your life becomes shorter and the hereafter nearer. Death follows you wherever you are. Neither of you will escape the other. The life of this world is transient, whereas the hereafter is everlasting. The former initiates the latter status, be it good or bad. And so this is somebody speaking to who was, again, the ruler of the Muslims at this time. And the Muslims were very vast and very strong at this time. They had defeated both the Romans and the Persians by this time. They were essentially the superpower. And this person was speaking to him this way, without any fear of retribution. Now there's a long story here, and this is the one that we'll finish with because it is kind of long, but it has some really good points. Talking about the etiquette of the people with the people of knowledge and the people of knowledge and their etiquette with the scholars. So Ad-Darimi, who's one of the scholars of Hadith, he reports Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik entered al-Madinah. Now Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik is one of the leaders of the Muslims after the time of Muawiyah and his sons. He was later on down the line from there, but he was part of the Umayyad, the Umayyad dynasty. So he's a leader, he's a ruler, and he's entering Medina. And he stayed there for some days, and he was wondering if there were any people who had lived with the Prophet's companions. So this is a time later, and so the companions are gone. He was looking for people that had been their students, the Tabi'in, so that he could meet them and talk to them and learn from them and benefit from them. So he was wondering if there was anybody left. He was told that there was only one of them whose name was Abu Hazm. So he summoned him. Reaching him, Suleiman said, Abu Hazm, what is this severance? I mean, why have you stayed away? And Abu Hazm wondered, what does this have to do with me? He said, all the nobles of Medina have visited me, but you have not. Remember we talked about earlier how the scholars used to stay away from the rulers? So all of the nobles of Medina have visited me, but you have not. This was the only tabi'i left in Medina at this time, the only student of the companions. And so Abu Hazm, he replies, he says, I have no relation with you to visit you. So I have no reason to visit you. You're not family, you're not anything like this, that I should have a need to visit you. He said, you have spoken rightly. Abu Hazm, why do you detest death? He said, because you have prospered this life and ignored the hereafter. So he's giving him advice now. He's saying, why do you hate death? He says, this is why. Because you do well in this life, forgetting the next life. Hence you prefer prosperity to adversity. And Sulaiman, he said, you've spoken rightly. This is actually similar, if you think about this is similar to the hadith of Jibril. Jibril asks different questions, we know them. What is Islam? What is Iman? What is Ihsan? And after he's asked the questions, each time he says what? Sadaqt. You have spoken truthfully. And so here Sulaiman is doing the same thing. He's asking Abu Hazm these questions, and after he answers, he says, you have spoken truthfully. You have spoken correctly. So you have spoken rightly. How shall we return to the Almighty? He said, the good doer returns to Allah like a traveler to his household, delighted and pleased, but the wrongdoer returns like an eloping slave returning to his master distressed. In other words, you ran away, and now you're being brought back to your master. How are you going to, what is your situation going to be like? You're going to be in trouble. So now Sulaiman, he asked him next, what share will we receive from Allah? He said, judge yourself according to the Quran, then you would know your share. Sulaiman asked, where can I find this in the Quran? So he mentions the ayahs, which mean, I'll just read the meanings here for time's sake. It says, the first one he mentions is where Allah says, as for the righteous, they will be in bliss, and the wicked, they will be in the hellfire. So it lets you know what's your end, if you're righteous or if you're wicked. And then he wondered, where is Allah's mercy? Suleiman asks him next, and he says, in the Quran, he says, the mercy of Allah is always near to those who do good. It's always near to those who do good. So he's advising him. He asked Abu Hazan, who is the most sensible of humans? He replied, the one who learns wisdom and then teaches it. So it's not simply that we take it in, but we also have to share it out. This is the thing many of my teachers have stressed over the years, is that when you learn something, the zakat that you pay is by teaching it. In other words, you pay the right that it has upon you by teaching it, and that's also a means of you deepening your understanding of the information as well. He said, who is the most foolish? He said, the one who follows the whims of a tyrant, preferring the tyrant's pleasure to their own hereafter. In other words, you make your intentions of pleasing the tyrants, pleasing the rulers, no matter what they ask, even if it means that you may jeopardize your hereafter. You make them your end-all, be-all. This is like the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had told us that there's no obedience to the creation and disobedience to the Creator. And so they've forgotten this. And they make all of their obedience to this creation, this ruler, in disobedience to the Creator, so that they jeopardize their own future to placate this ruler for some transient goods in this life. And he said, what is the supplication that is to be answered? He said, it is that of the humble and the sincere. And what is the best charity? He said, that is spent on the poor. And Suleiman then asked, what time is it? Okay. We'll probably close with this story, inshallah. Suleiman then asked, what about my office? Abu Hazan asked him to pardon him from the answer, but Suleiman insisted. Now he was asking about his position in leadership. And Abu Hazan was like, please don't make me have to answer this. So he knows that he's going to have to say some things that he may not like at this point. So he's saying, please let me. He goes, and then so he forces him to answer, and he says, okay, some people have appropriated this right with neither consultation nor consensus. Thus they have shed innocent blood to enjoy this world, but they have passed away. I wonder, how have they been reckoned, and how have they responded? So he's warning him about how he gets this power and what he does with this power. How will you be reckoned at the end of it all? Then a man said to him, so after hearing him say this to him, speaking to him kind of harshly, says, what an evil reply. Abu Hazm rebuked him, saying, you are a liar. The Almighty has pledged scholars to clarify it to the people. So he's saying, this is my duty. As a scholar, it's my duty to make sure that I clarify. I can't remain silent in front of these things. It's like if I'm going to speak, I have to speak truth. Otherwise, I need to be quiet. You know, if I'm going to speak, it has to be truth. Otherwise, I should stay silent. I should not put myself in that situation where I have to speak to them, etc. And this is clarified to me. Asked him to visit him in the morning. So then Suleiman, this was the end of their meeting. He asked him to visit him the next morning so he could learn more from him and to give him a gift. But Abu Hazm declined. He didn't want to come back to get the gift. Not so much to give the knowledge, but to get the gift. He knew that he was looking to be ingratiated. And so he asked him about this. Why not? You know, in his mind, he's trying to honor him. And he told him, he said, I fear from inclining to you a little bit. In that case, we should have made to taste equal punishment in this life and in death. In other words, he was afraid of becoming, you know, like leaning in his favor and, you know, like making statements or doing things, or like we mentioned in earlier sessions, remaining silent in the face of things that he says or does. That if he might incline to them and not want to offend them or not want to do whatever, that then he's going to remain silent about some of these things. And he's going to expose himself to punishment because of it, etc. And Suleiman asked his advice at the end here, and he said, lo, fear Allah, indeed, he should not find you where he has forbidden you. So this is closing advice to Suleiman. Fear Allah and don't let him find you where he's forbidden you, and don't let him not find you where he told you that you should be. So For instance, in modern terms, it's like, don't let him find you in the nightclub. And don't let him miss you in the masjid. Be where you're supposed to be and don't be where you're not. And so that was the closing for him. And Suleiman asked him to pray him, so where Abu Hazm said, "O Lord, if Suleiman is your friend, make goodness convenient to him. If not, guide him to goodness." So he ordered that 100 dirhams were given to Abu Hazm, but he declined it. So this is an example of the etiquettes that they had with the scholars. And this is a long section here, so we're going to move past this for next week. We're going to get into the next section next week, which is, we're still in the chapter of commanding good and forbidding evil, but the section that they come up to next is listening to songs and music, is what we'll be talking about in the matters of relating good and evil to that. So we don't want to take much more of our time. If there's any questions or anything else real quick, we can try and touch upon that. Otherwise, we can finish. And yes, indeed, there is tea, and I was told somebody brought cookies as well. So if that's all, we can chat over tea and cookies, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.